in the harsh and unforgiving American West of 1887, where survival often meant turning your back on your neighbor and compassion was seen as weakness, one woman dared to choose kindness over conformity. This is the story of Martha Coleman, a pioneer whose generous heart would put her at odds with an entire community, and of Joseph Crow Feather, an Apache scout whose unexpected intervention would challenge everything the townspeople believed about justice, mercy, and what it truly means to be human. In a land where the law was often written with bullets and fear ruled over fairness, these two unlikely allies would discover that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply doing what's right, no matter the cost. Before we dive into this powerful tale of courage and redemption, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the face of hatred deserve to be shared with every soul who still believes in the power of standing up for what's right. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Bitter Creek, Arizona Territory, as Martha Coleman made her way to the general store with careful, measured steps. At 32, she had the weathered hands of a woman who knew hard work, but her eyes still held the gentle warmth that had made her late husband fall in love with her 7 years ago, before consumption took him and left her alone on their small homestead. Martha's cabin sat 2 miles outside of town, a modest structure of rough-hewn logs and determination that she had helped build with her own hands. It wasn't much to look at, but it was hers, and in a territory where women rarely owned property, that meant everything. She had managed to keep it running through sheer will and the small income she earned taking in washing and mending for the townspeople. The general store was buzzing with the usual morning gossip when Martha entered, her worn boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. Behind the counter, Henry Watkins looked up from his ledger with the practiced smile of a man who knew the value of every customer, no matter how small their purchases. "Morning, Mrs. Coleman," he said, his voice carrying the careful politeness reserved for those who paid their bills on time but weren't quite part of the town's inner circle. "What can I do for you today?" "Just some flour and beans, Mr. Watkins," Martha replied, counting out the coins from her small purse. "And maybe some of that dried beef if you can spare it." As Henry gathered her modest order, Martha became aware of the conversation taking place near the pickle barrel, where 3 of the town's most prominent citizens were speaking in voices they clearly intended to be overheard. "It's a disgrace, I tell you," Mrs. Abigail Thornton was saying, her voice sharp with righteous indignation. "That woman has been nothing but trouble since the day she arrived, and now she's got the nerve to come begging for charity." "Charity she don't deserve," added Samuel Morrison, the town's self-appointed moral authority. "A woman like that, with her reputation. She made her choices, and now she wants the rest of us to pay for them." The third member of their group, Dr. Edmund Hayes, nodded gravely. "I've told the church board that we cannot, in good conscience, provide assistance to someone who has so clearly strayed from the path of righteousness. It would send the wrong message to our young people." Martha's hand stilled on her purse as she realized they were talking about Rebecca Walsh, the young widow who had arrived in Bitter Creek 3 months ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a baby barely old enough to walk. Rebecca's husband had died in a mining accident, leaving her with no family and no means of support. But it wasn't her poverty that had turned the town against her. It was the whispered rumors about her past, the speculation that she had been married to her husband for less than 9 months when the baby was born. In a community where reputation was everything and forgiveness was in short supply, Rebecca had been branded as fallen woman, unworthy of help or sympathy. She had been turned away from the church, refused service at most businesses, and forced to live in a ramshackle lean-to behind the livery stable with her infant son. "Here you go, Mrs. Coleman," Henry said, placing her purchases in a small burlap sack. "That'll be $2.15. Martha paid without comment, but as she turned to leave, she found herself face to face with Mrs. Thornton, whose steel-gray eyes were fixed on her with unmistakable disapproval. "I trust you heard our conversation, Martha," Mrs. Thornton said, using her first name with the casual dismissal of someone who considered herself superior. "I hope you understand the importance of maintaining proper standards in our community. We cannot allow certain elements to take root here." Martha met her gaze steadily. "I heard you, Mrs. Thornton. I heard every word." Without another word, Martha walked out of the store, but instead of heading home, she found herself walking toward the livery stable. She had seen Rebecca Walsh from a distance several times, always hurrying through the back alleys with her head down and her baby clutched tightly to her chest. But they had never spoken. The lean-to behind the stable was even worse than Martha had imagined. Constructed from scrap wood and canvas, it provided little protection from the elements. Through a gap in the makeshift wall, Martha could see Rebecca sitting on a pile of straw, trying to coax her listless baby to take some water from a cracked cup. Rebecca looked up as Martha approached, her eyes immediately filling with the wary fear of someone who had learned to expect the worst from every encounter. "Mrs. Walsh," Martha said gently, "my name is Martha Coleman. I live just outside of town." Rebecca struggled to her feet, clutching her baby protectively. "If you've come to tell me to move on, I understand. I've been trying to save enough for passage somewhere else. But I haven't come to tell you to leave," Martha interrupted. "I've come to see if you need help." The words hung in the air between them, and Martha saw something flicker in Rebecca's eyes, a desperate hope that she was clearly afraid to trust. "I don't have much," Martha continued, "but I have enough. There's a small room in my cabin that's not being used, and I could use help with the washing and mending. It wouldn't be charity. You'd be earning your keep." Rebecca's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. "You don't understand," she whispered. "They've told you things about me, haven't they? About my past." Martha looked at the young woman. She couldn't be more than 20, holding her sick baby in a shelter that wouldn't house animals, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest. "I don't care about your past," Martha said firmly. "I care about what's happening right now. You're a mother with a baby who needs help, and I'm a woman with the means to provide it. Everything else is just talk." That afternoon, Martha helped Rebecca gather her few possessions and walked with her back to the cabin. As they passed through town, she was acutely aware of the stares and whispered conversations that followed in their wake. By evening, she knew, everyone in Bitter Creek would know that Martha Coleman had taken in the fallen woman. She was right. Before the sun had set, 3 men on horseback appeared at her door: Samuel Morrison, Dr. Hayes, and Tom Bradley, the town's unofficial enforcer. They sat their horses in her yard like judges preparing to deliver a verdict. "Mrs. Coleman," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We need to have a word with you." Martha stepped onto her porch, very aware that Rebecca was inside with her baby, probably listening to every word. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" "You can start by explaining what you think you're doing," Dr. Hayes said, his usual bedside manner nowhere in evidence. "Taking in that woman and her bastard child. Do you have any idea what kind of message that sends?" "It sends the message that I believe in Christian charity," Martha replied evenly. "I thought that was something we all valued in this community." Tom Bradley leaned forward in his saddle, his hand resting meaningfully on the gun at his hip. "There's charity, and then there's foolishness, Mrs. Coleman. That woman is trouble, and trouble has a way of spreading." "The only trouble I see," Martha said, her voice growing stronger, "is 3 grown men trying to intimidate a woman for showing kindness to someone in need." Morrison's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, Mrs. Coleman. This community has standards, and we intend to maintain them. If you continue down this path, you may find that your neighbors are not as understanding as you might hope." The threat was clear, but Martha stood her ground. "My neighbors are welcome to their opinions, Mr. Morrison, but this is my property, and I'll decide who's welcome here." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Martha could see the calculation in their eyes. They had expected her to back down, to send Rebecca away rather than face the community's disapproval. Her defiance had clearly caught them off guard. "Think carefully about your choices, Mrs. Coleman," Dr. Hayes said as they prepared to leave. "Some decisions can't be undone." As they rode away, Martha remained on her porch until their dust had settled. Only then did she allow herself to acknowledge the fear that was gnawing at her stomach. She had made powerful enemies today, and in a place like Bitter Creek, That could be dangerous. But when she went back inside and saw Rebecca feeding her baby with tears of gratitude in her eyes, Martha knew she had made the right choice. Whatever came next, she would face it with a clear conscience. 3 weeks had passed since Rebecca Walsh had moved into Martha's cabin, and the change in both women was remarkable. Rebecca had regained some of the color in her cheeks, and her baby, little Samuel, was finally thriving on regular meals and the warmth of a real home. For her part, Martha found that she enjoyed the company after so many years of solitude, and Rebecca's help with the washing and mending had actually improved their small business. But if life inside the cabin had improved, the situation in town had grown increasingly hostile. Martha's weekly trips to the general store had become exercises in endurance, as conversations stopped when she entered and resumed in pointed whispers when she passed. Several customers had stopped bringing their washing to her, claiming they had found other arrangements. Most troubling of all were the visits from various townspeople, each carrying the same message delivered with varying degrees of subtlety: send the woman away, or face the consequences. On this particular morning, Martha was hanging laundry on the line behind her cabin when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Through the sheets flapping in the desert wind, she could see a group of riders, more than had ever come before. Her heart began to race as she counted them. 8 men, all armed, all wearing the grim expressions of those who had come to deliver an ultimatum. "Rebecca," she called softly toward the cabin, "take Samuel and go to the root cellar. Stay there until I come for you." Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her face pale with understanding. She had been expecting this day, had probably been preparing for it, since the moment Martha had offered her shelter. Without a word, she gathered her baby and disappeared around the back of the cabin. Martha smoothed her skirts and walked to the front of her property, where the riders had arranged themselves in a semicircle. She recognized most of them, Morrison and Dr. Hayes, of course, but also Henry Watkins from the general store, Pastor Williams from the church, and several other prominent citizens. Tom Bradley sat his horse slightly apart from the others, his hand resting on his gun in a gesture that was clearly meant to be seen. "Gentlemen," Martha said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, "to what do I owe this delegation?" Pastor Williams urged his horse forward, his usually kind face set in lines of stern disapproval. "Mrs. Coleman, we've come to give you one final opportunity to do the right thing. Send that woman away, and we can all pretend this unfortunate episode never happened." "And if I refuse?" Martha asked, though she already knew the answer. Morrison's smile was cold and without humor. "Then we'll be forced to take steps to protect the moral integrity of our community. We cannot allow your misguided charity to corrupt our young people or encourage others to follow your example." Dr. Hayes leaned forward in his saddle. "You're a widow, Mrs. Coleman, alone and vulnerable. Surely you can see the wisdom in maintaining good relations with your neighbors. What would happen to you if you fell ill, or if your cabin caught fire? Who would help you then?" The threat was clear, but Martha refused to be intimidated. "Are you threatening me, Dr. Hayes?" "We're offering you a choice," Tom Bradley said, his voice carrying the flat menace of a man who enjoyed his work. "Make the right decision, and you can continue to live here in peace. Make the wrong one." He shrugged, letting the implication hang in the air. Martha looked at each of their faces, seeing the certainty of their righteousness, the absolute conviction that they were in the right. These were men who attended church every Sunday, who spoke of Christian values and community spirit, yet they were prepared to destroy a woman's life for the crime of showing mercy to someone in need. "I've made my decision," Martha said quietly. "Rebecca Walsh is welcome in my home for as long as she needs shelter. If that troubles you, I suggest you examine your own consciences." The silence that followed her words was heavy with menace. Finally, Morrison spoke, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "So be it, Mrs. Coleman. You've chosen your path. Now you'll live with the consequences." As the riders turned to leave, Pastor Williams lingered for a moment, his face troubled. "Martha," he said softly, "I've known you since you came to this territory. You're a good woman, but you're making a terrible mistake. It's not too late to change your mind." It's not too late for any of us to change our minds, Pastor, Martha replied. The question is whether we'll choose fear or compassion. Pastor Williams shook his head sadly and rode away, leaving Martha alone in her yard with the dust settling around her feet and the weight of what was coming pressing down on her shoulders. That evening, as Martha and Rebecca sat by the fire, with little Samuel sleeping peacefully in his makeshift crib, Rebecca finally spoke the words that had been hanging between them for weeks. I should go, she said quietly. I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to bring trouble to your door. Martha looked up from her mending, her needles suspended in midair. Where would you go? You have no money, no family, no place that would take you in. I don't know, Rebecca admitted, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. But I can't let them hurt you because of me. You've been kinder to me than anyone has ever been, and I won't repay that kindness by destroying your life. Martha set down her sewing and moved to sit beside the younger woman. Rebecca, listen to me. What's happening here isn't about you. It's about fear, fear of change, fear of anything that challenges their comfortable certainties. If I send you away now, it won't solve anything. It will just teach them that threats and intimidation work. But what if they really do burn down your cabin? Rebecca whispered. What if they hurt you? Martha was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire and thinking about the life she had built here, the home she had created with her own hands and her husband's memory. Then she thought about the baby sleeping peacefully nearby, and the young woman who had been cast out by a community that claimed to follow the teachings of Christ. Then we'll face whatever comes together, Martha said finally, because some things are worth fighting for, even if the fight seems hopeless. Outside, the desert wind howled around the cabin, and in the distance, the lights of Bitter Creek flickered like hostile stars. Neither woman slept well that night, and both knew that the morning would bring a reckoning that would change everything. But what they didn't know was that they were not as alone as they believed. In the darkness beyond the reach of their lamplight, a figure moved silently through the sage brush, watching and waiting. Joseph Crow Feather had been tracking the movements of the townspeople for days, and he had seen enough to know that trouble was coming. The Apache scout had his own reasons for watching over the woman who had shown kindness to an outcast, reasons that went back to a debt of honor that few white people would understand. But understanding wasn't necessary. What mattered was that when the time came, he would be ready. The attack came 3 nights later, under a moonless sky that provided perfect cover for men with dark intentions. Martha woke to the sound of horses and voices, the acrid smell of coal oil, and the terrible certainty that her worst fears were about to be realized. She slipped from her bed and peered through the window, her heart sinking as she saw the orange glow of torches surrounding her cabin. At least a dozen men sat their horses in a loose circle around her property, their faces hidden by bandanas, but their intentions unmistakably clear. Martha Coleman. The voice belonged to Tom Bradley, though he made no effort to disguise it. You've had your warning. Send out the whore and her bastard, or we'll burn you all out. Martha's hand shook as she pulled on her robe and moved to Rebecca's room. The young woman was already awake, clutching her baby to her chest, with tears streaming down her face. I have to go to them, Rebecca whispered. Maybe if I surrender myself. No, Martha said firmly. We stay together, no matter what happens. The 2 women moved to the main room of the cabin, where Martha retrieved her late husband's rifle from above the fireplace. She had never fired it at another human being, but she knew how to use it, and the men outside would know that too. This is your last chance, Coleman. Bradley shouted. We know you're in there. Send out the woman, or we'll come in and get her. Martha opened the front door, just wide enough to be seen, the rifle held ready in her hands. This is my property, and these are my guests. You have no right to be here. A chorus of harsh laughter greeted her words. Rights. Morrison's voice carried clearly across the yard. You gave up your rights when you chose to harbor a fallen woman. Now you'll face the consequences. One of the riders threw his torch toward the cabin, and Martha watched in horror as it landed on her roof, the dry wood immediately beginning to smolder. Another torch followed, then another, until small fires were beginning to take hold in several places. "Please," Martha called out, desperation creeping into her voice. "There's a baby in here. An innocent child. Should have thought of that before you chose to defy your betters." Dr. Hayes shouted back, "Some lessons have to be learned the hard way." The smell of smoke was growing stronger, and Martha could hear the ominous crackling of flames beginning to spread. She looked back at Rebecca, who was standing frozen with terror, her baby crying in her arms. "The root cellar," Martha said urgently. "We can get out through the back and make it to the root cellar. Maybe they won't see us in the smoke." But as they moved toward the back door, more torches arced through the air, and Martha realized with growing horror that the men had positioned themselves to cut off every escape route. They weren't just trying to drive Rebecca away. They intended to burn them all alive. It was then, as the flames began to lick at the walls and the smoke grew thick enough to choke them, that a new voice cut through the night air. It was calm, measured, and carried an authority that made even the mounted men pause in their destruction. "That's enough." The voice belonged to a man who stepped out of the darkness as if he had materialized from the desert itself. He was tall and lean, with the weathered features of someone who had spent his life under the open sky. His long black hair was tied back with a leather cord, and he wore the practical clothing of a scout, buckskin pants, a cotton shirt, and boots that made no sound as he moved. Joseph Crow Feather walked into the circle of firelight with the unhurried confidence of a man who feared nothing the night could bring. In his hands, he carried a rifle that looked well used and carefully maintained, and his dark eyes swept over the mounted men with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing potential threats. "Who the hell are you?" Tom Bradley demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "I'm the man telling you to put out those fires and ride away," Joseph replied, his voice carrying no emotion, but somehow managing to convey absolute menace. "Now," Morrison urged his horse forward, his face twisted with outrage. "This is none of your concern, Indian. This is white man's business." Joseph's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, like a coiled spring preparing to release. "The woman in that cabin once gave water to my horse and food to me when I was tracking raiders through this territory. That makes it my business. One redskin against 12 white men." Bradley laughed, but there was an edge of nervousness in his voice. "I like those odds." "Then you're a fool," Joseph said simply, "but you're welcome to test them." The standoff stretched for long seconds, the only sounds the crackling of flames and the nervous shifting of horses. Martha watched from her doorway, hardly daring to breathe, as this stranger, this Apache scout she had helped months ago and barely remembered, faced down a dozen armed men to protect her. It was Pastor Williams who finally broke the silence. "Tom, maybe we should reconsider. This has gone far enough." "The hell it has." Bradley snarled. "I'm not backing down from some savage." His hand dropped to his gun, but before he could clear leather, Joseph's rifle was at his shoulder, the barrel trained on Bradley's chest with the steady precision of a man who never missed his target. "Your choice," Joseph said quietly, "but choose quickly. The lady's cabin is burning." For a moment, the night balanced on a knife's edge. Then Dr. Hayes spoke up, his voice tight with fear. "Tommy's right. We've made our point. Let's go." One by one, the other men began to back their horses away from the cabin. Only Bradley remained, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "Not by a long shot." "Yes, it is," Joseph replied, his rifle never wavering. "Because if I see any of you near this cabin again, I won't bother with warnings." Finally, Bradley wheeled his horse around and galloped away, followed by the rest of the riders. Their torches disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the smell of smoke and the sound of Martha frantically beating out the flames that had taken hold on her roof. Joseph lowered his rifle and walked toward the cabin, where Martha and Rebecca were working desperately to save their home. Without a word, he climbed onto the roof and began stamping out the larger fires, his movements efficient and sure. It took the better part of an hour to extinguish all the flames, but when it was done, the cabin was still standing. damaged but salvageable. Martha stood in her yard, looking up at the man who had saved their lives, and struggled to find words adequate to express her gratitude. "Thank you," she said finally, knowing how inadequate the words were. "I don't know why you helped us, but thank you." Joseph climbed down from the roof and stood before her, his dark eyes reflecting the last of the dying embers. "You gave me food and water when I needed it. You didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. You just helped." Martha remembered now, a lone rider who had stopped at her cabin months ago, travel-worn and weary. She had offered him a meal and water for his horse, as she would have done for any traveler. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time. "That was nothing," she said. "Just common courtesy." "Common courtesy is not so common," Joseph replied, "especially not between our peoples. You saw a man who needed help, and you helped him. Tonight, I returned a favor." Rebecca stepped forward, her baby quiet now in her arms. "Will they come back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Joseph considered the question seriously. "Not tonight. Maybe not at all. Men like that are brave when they think they face no opposition. When they discover they're wrong, they often find other causes to champion." "And if they do come back?" Martha asked. Joseph's smile was slight, but somehow reassuring. "Then they'll find me waiting for them." As the Apache scout melted back into the darkness from which he had emerged, Martha and Rebecca stood in the ruins of their yard, surrounded by the smell of smoke and the knowledge that they had witnessed something extraordinary. A stranger had risked his life for them, had stood against a mob to protect two women he barely knew. In a territory where hatred and fear too often ruled the day, one man had chosen to honor a debt of kindness with an act of courage that would be remembered long after the ashes had blown away. Dawn broke over Bitter Creek with an unusual quiet, as if the very air was holding its breath in the aftermath of the previous night's events. Word of what had happened at Martha Coleman's cabin spread through the town like wildfire, carried by the shamefaced riders who had returned home with their tails between their legs and their reputations in tatters. The story grew in the telling, as stories do, but the essential facts remained unchanged. A dozen armed men had been faced down by a single Apache scout, and their attempt to burn out Martha Coleman had ended in humiliating failure. Martha herself was in town that morning, walking down Main Street with her head held high and her market basket in her hand. The damage to her cabin was reparable, and she had work to do. But more than that, she had a point to make. The reaction to her presence was immediate and telling. Some people crossed the street to avoid her, their faces flushed with shame at what had been done in their name. Others stared openly, as if trying to reconcile the quiet woman they knew with the defiant figure who had stood up to the town's most powerful men. But it was the third group that surprised Martha the most, the people who nodded respectfully as she passed, who met her eyes with something that looked like admiration. Mrs. Sarah Jenkins, the schoolteacher, actually stopped to speak with her. "Mrs. Coleman," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard, "I wanted you to know that not everyone in this town agrees with what happened last night. Some of us think you did the right thing." Martha felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. That means more than you know. There's going to be a town meeting tonight," Mrs. Jenkins continued. "Pastor Williams called it. I think you should be there." The meeting was held in the church, the only building in Bitter Creek large enough to hold the entire population. Martha arrived to find the pews packed and the air thick with tension. She took a seat near the back, very aware of the whispered conversations that stopped when people noticed her presence. Pastor Williams stood at the pulpit, his usually confident demeanor replaced by something that looked suspiciously like uncertainty. He cleared his throat several times before beginning to speak. "Friends, neighbors," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "We're here tonight because of the events that took place last evening. Events that have forced us to examine our consciences and ask ourselves some difficult questions." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Martha could see Tom Bradley and his supporters shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "I've spent the day in prayer and reflection," Pastor Williams continued, "and I've come to realize that we have lost our way. In our zeal to maintain what we call moral standards, We have forgotten the most basic teachings of our faith. We have forgotten compassion. We have forgotten mercy. We have forgotten that we are called to love our neighbors as ourselves. That woman is not our neighbor, someone called out from the crowd. She's a stranger, a fallen woman who is a child of God, just as we all are. Pastor Williams interrupted, his voice growing stronger. Who deserves our help, not our condemnation. Who needed shelter and found it with the one person in this community brave enough to offer it. The murmur grew louder, and Martha could see the crowd beginning to divide. Some faces showed agreement with the pastor's words, while others remained hard with disapproval. Dr. Hayes stood up, his face flushed with anger. Pastor, with all due respect, you weren't there last night. You didn't see that savage threatening decent white men with a rifle. Are we supposed to stand by while Indians dictate how we run our community? That savage, as you call him, came a new voice from the back of the church. Saved 3 lives last night while you and your friends were trying to commit murder. All heads turned to see Joseph Crow Feather standing in the doorway, his presence causing a ripple of shock and fear to run through the congregation. He walked slowly down the aisle, his boots echoing in the sudden silence, until he stood before the pulpit. I am Joseph Crow Feather, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the church. I scout for the army, and I have lived in peace with your people for many years. Last night, I watched 12 men try to burn alive 2 women and a baby. If that is what you call decent behavior, then perhaps it is time to reconsider your definitions. Tom Bradley jumped to his feet, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun before he remembered where he was. You have no right to be here. This is a Christian church. And yet, Joseph replied calmly, I seem to be the only one here who acted like a Christian last night. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, Mrs. Jenkins stood up. He's right, she said, her voice shaking but determined. We talk about Christian values, but when did we last show Christian love? When did we last help someone who truly needed it? One by one, other people began to stand. The blacksmith, John Murphy, rose from his seat near the front. I was there last night, he said, his voice heavy with shame. I went along because I thought it was the right thing to do. But watching that man risk his life to protect strangers, it made me realize how far we've fallen. More people stood, and Martha felt tears beginning to flow down her cheeks as she realized that the tide was turning. Not everyone would change their minds. She could see the hard faces of those who remained seated, the ones who would never accept that they had been wrong. But enough people were standing to make a difference. Finally, Pastor Williams spoke again. I propose that we, as a community, formally apologize to Mrs. Coleman and Mrs. Walsh for the treatment they have received. And I propose that we establish a fund to help repair the damage done to Mrs. Coleman's property. And I propose, added Mrs. Jenkins, that we welcome Mrs. Walsh and her son into our community properly. She needs work, and I need an assistant at the school. If she's willing, the position is hers. Rebecca, who had been sitting quietly beside Martha throughout the meeting, began to cry. For the first time since arriving in Bitter Creek, she was being offered not just tolerance, but acceptance. The vote was not unanimous. It never could have been in a community so divided, but it was decisive enough to send a clear message. Bitter Creek was ready to choose compassion over fear, inclusion over exclusion. As the meeting broke up and people began to file out of the church, many stopped to speak with Martha, offering apologies and assistance. But it was Joseph Crow Feather who lingered longest, waiting until the church was nearly empty before approaching her. You started something here tonight, he said quietly. Something important. Martha shook her head. You're the one who made the difference. If you hadn't been there last night, if you hadn't shown kindness to a stranger months ago, I wouldn't have been there at all, Joseph replied. Kindness has a way of returning when you need it most. As they walked out of the church together, the white widow, the Apache scout, and the young mother with her baby, Martha reflected on the strange turns that life could take. A simple act of hospitality had saved her life, and her act of defiance had begun to change an entire community. It wouldn't be easy. There would still be those who opposed change, who clung to their prejudices and fears. Tom Bradley and his supporters had not been converted by one meeting, and they would continue to cause trouble. But something fundamental had shifted in Bitter Creek that night. The seeds of change had been planted, watered by courage, and nurtured by the recognition that true strength came not from excluding others, but from including them. As Martha looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, she thought about the future, uncertain, challenging, but bright with possibility. She had learned that standing up for what was right was never easy, but it was always worth it. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you discovered that you weren't standing alone after all. And there you have it, folks, a powerful reminder that in the darkest times, courage can come from the most unexpected places. Martha Coleman's simple act of kindness created ripples that changed an entire community, while Joseph Crow Feather proved that honor knows no boundaries of race or culture. If this story of standing up for what's right in the face of overwhelming opposition moved you, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage and redemption from the American frontier. Because sometimes, the greatest victories aren't won with guns or gold, but with the simple decision to choose compassion over fear, inclusion over hatred. Until next time, remember that every act of kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change the world.